Welcome back to Algebra Chapter 8, Part 2. This video is going to go over Section 8.5b. 8.5b is going to be really similar to 8.5a when we were pulling out the greatest common factor. We're still going to use all of those skills. However, what we are going to do is we're going to factor a polynomial that has 4 terms. When you have 4 terms or more, you can usually factor it out by some sort of grouping things into pairs. So how do we do this? How do we factor by grouping? Well, wonderful. We have 3 steps for you. First step is to group it into pairs. Everyone knows that pairs means 2. If you think that moving something around and using your commutative property is needed or will be helpful, then go ahead and do that. And of course, I already said it, but commutative property means we can reorder. All right, after you have grouped it into pairs, your second step is going to be what we were doing yesterday, or what we were doing in 8.5a. We want to factor out the greatest common factor of each pair separately. Let's make sure that we are doing this separately. After we've done that, this is where we get something that's a little bit new and where things get sometimes a little tricky. We want to look to see if we have common factors at the end. Now, what does that really mean? Common factors at the end mean look at your parentheses. Look at your parentheses and see if they are the same thing. If they are, then we will deal with that in the example. All right, go ahead and look at practice problem number 3. Do me a favor, when I was typing these up, I got a little carried away and forgot to put my b here. So that first term should be 4ab. Now let's go ahead and go through our steps. That first step said to break it into pairs. I'm going to take my first 2 terms, and I'm going to take whatever sign's in the middle in my last 2 terms. I like to write it back out. And throw an extra plus sign in here. Since it's a positive 3, I'm just going to write it as 3. All right, so there's step 1. If I move on to step 2, I'm going to look at each part individually or separately. So I'm going to cover it up so I can't even see it. If you want to do the same, put a piece of paper over it. If you are still working on finding your greatest common factor by prime factorization, please feel free to do so. However, I would recommend pausing the video as I am not going to write down the prime factorization. My greatest common factor of 4ab and 8b. Well, I know 4 is a factor of 8, so I'm going to say my greatest common factor is 4. They both have a b, so I need my b as well. Go ahead and write down your greatest common factor. 4b times what gets me to 4ab? Well, all I'm missing here is an a. And then 4b times what gets me to 8b? I would need to multiply that by 2. I reached my last term, so I can go ahead and close out my parentheses. And that is done. So I've got one side done, now I've got to do the other. This is where I was saying we're doing the same thing just a couple more times than we were before. So if I look at these, I know my Greatest common factor. Again, if you want to prime factorize, pause now. Otherwise, I'm going to spoil the surprise. Your greatest common factor here is going to be a 3. If I was to write that down, 3, open my parentheses. 3 times a will get me to my 3a. In order to get to a positive 6, I would have to multiply 3 by a positive 2. Reached my last term, so I can close out my parentheses. Took care of both parts, I can get rid of my shade. Make sure you don't lose your plus sign that was in between those. All right, this is where things start to get new. This is that third step. For step number 3, I said look at the parentheses. All right, there's my black parentheses and my blue parentheses. Do they have the same thing? One says a plus 2, the other says a plus 2. They're the exact same thing. So this is how I go about it. I'm going to write what's in my parentheses, a plus 2. And then I'm going to look at what was left over. And those are going to make another set of parentheses. So my first term, I had a 4b. So I'm going to start another set of parentheses and say I have a 4b. And over here I have a positive 3. So I'm going to add on 3. And now I can close my parentheses. So when you're grouping it into a factor of a 4 terms, you should end up with 2 binomials. And here's the thing. If you decided to write 4ab plus 3 first, let's make sure we group those real quick. If you wrote this one first, and then your a plus 2. So if you wrote it in that order, is that still a correct answer? Of course it is. It's still correct. The commutative law says that we can do that. We can reorder our multiplication. I just normally choose to write mine like this. I don't want to forget about those parentheses. I try to get those done first and then deal with the rest. Does that sound like a doable thing? Hopefully you're saying yes, but let's do one more example just in case. Let's go ahead and jump to number 5. All right, that first step, make sure we break it into pairs. My first pair is going to be 15a minus 3ab. Throw in my plus sign that I want to add. Then I have a positive 4b, so I'm going to say I have a 4b and a negative 20. All right, I broke it into pairs. Let's make sure we look at these separately. Pause now if you like to prime factorize. Otherwise, your greatest common factor would be a 3 and an a. They both share an a. 3 goes into both of them. It is its largest factor. Once I have my greatest common factor, I can go ahead and write it down. Open a set of parentheses. What times 3a gets me to 15a? That would be a 5. What times 3a gets me to a negative 3ab? I would need a negative b. Now let's look at our second half. I have a 4b minus 20. If you would like to prime factorize, pause now. Otherwise, here your greatest common factor is going to be 4. 4 goes into 4b, 4 goes into 20. They don't both share that b. Write down your greatest common factor. 4 times what gets me to 4b? Well, I still need a b. 4 times what gets me to that negative 20? Well, that's going to be a negative 5. And here's where we can go ahead and get rid of our divider. Don't forget to bring down your little plus sign. Step 3, look at your parentheses. Are they the same? Well, no. One says 5 minus b, the other says b minus 5. Well, I know that my 5's positive here, and my b is negative here. Here, my b is positive, my 5 is negative. So how can I change the signs of one of those? Because that's the only thing that's different between them, right? They both have the b, they both have the 5, they just both have opposite signs. In order to do this, I'm going to say that I want to multiply it by a negative, right? Only instead to multiply by that negative, I am going to put it out here in front of my 4. So if I was to rewrite this, I'm going to leave my first term exactly the same. Multiplied this whole thing by a negative, and that gave me a plus negative 4. And because I want to distribute that negative all the way out here, I am going to say that this is now negative b plus 5. Multiplied each part of that by a negative. Or another way to say that, instead of multiplying by a negative, you could say you factored out a negative. There was a negative buried in here with the b minus 5, and I said, okay, well, I need to factor it out. I'm going to make that a negative 4 instead of a positive 4. Once we are here, are my parentheses the same? Let's go back and check. Well, they're not necessarily exactly identical right now, but do they at least have the same sign? 5 is positive, b is negative in the first one. Second one, b is negative, 5 is positive. I could rearrange them to make them look exactly the same. Since I can rearrange them to look exactly the same, I know I can move on. I'm going to write this as 5 minus b, just because I don't like to have those floating negatives. If you wanted to write that as negative b plus 5, you can write it that way as well. Now what's left in front? The first one, I'm left with a 3a. The second one, I'm left with a plus negative 4. If it's a plus negative 4, can I go ahead and write that as a minus 4? The answer is yes. If you don't like that, go ahead and put a plus negative 4. That's okay too. So the reason that I wanted to make sure that we looked at number 5 is for this part right here, where we saw that they had opposite signs. When you have the same numbers in your parentheses, but they have opposite signs, we want to go ahead and factor out a negative. In other words, we're going to take one of them and we're going to say, okay, I'm going to put a negative in front of it and change both of my signs inside. That is all I have for you for section 8.5b. So let's go ahead and check out our lesson summary. For your stamp, what I need to know is, are you allowed to rearrange the terms before grouping into two pairs? How might that be helpful? Or why might that be helpful? And for our practice problem, go ahead and try and factor 2xy plus y minus 4x minus 2. In order to get your stamp for this lesson, of course, you need to have both of these completed, so don't forget to do them. I hope that you learned something new, and I look forward to seeing you in class with some questions.